Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of StreamTime Sports. I'm your host, Nick Meacham, CEO at Sports Pro. Now, this week is the build-up to Christmas, and this will be coming out just before everyone breaks for a nice few days off between Christmas and the New Year. As you might see, for those watching at home, there's a slightly new setup for me, which I'm hoping will continue to evolve over the new year, but it's nice to have a little change up and something different from what I've been dealing with before. And as you might be picking up, I am fighting off a little bit of a cold here, or as the Swedish like to say, a förkylning, which is almost a cold, but not quite a cold. So I'm pushing it back for hopefully to be able to enjoy a nice Christmas break. And for this particularly, say, festive edition of the podcast, I'm pretty thrilled to be joined by Rob Pilgrim, who's the head of sport for EMEA at Meta. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, great to be here.
Now, it's been a fun December for myself. I looked up a report the other day, and there's been 30 minutes of sunlight in Stockholm this year, which is the worst since 1934. But Christmas is nearly here. I'm quite excited about Christmas. Rob, you just started this new role with Meta. Will you get some time to have a little break through those few weeks before kicking off a new year, which you've got ahead of you?
Yeah, for sure. There's a nice moment to take a breather. I've been at Meta now this is 3 months. So really joining since the summer and then looking forward to this as a bit of a break. So yeah, I'll be off for best part of 10 days, which will be nice. And then kicking off again in the new year, which will be very, very welcome. We've had a really busy Q4, so lots to talk about.
Absolutely. Now, for those that are regular listeners to the podcast, would have heard your name mentioned a couple of times on the podcast as we've talked about you and what you were doing at YouTube in your previous role. And that was something like 8.5 years there. I want to touch on that because we've been talking a lot about YouTube of late and then obviously move things into what you're doing at Meta. So let's look back a little bit. What was it like there? I mean, the journey from outside in looked like a pretty crazy one from what not only YouTube is as a business and as a platform, but then it's also its role in sports. What was that like for you?
Yeah, it was an unbelievable ride. And I think that's the way I've described it to a few people. I was at the broader Google company for 14 years and like you say, YouTube for the majority of that. And I reflect that it's a time that I'm very, very proud of what we were able to build with the industry, with the partners. And a lot of those conversations started when I joined, of partners either not being on the platform and having to launch them, or partners that were suing us because of various issues that they had with YouTube. And by the time I left, and this is what you've spoken about a lot, I know, on your show and at the events, is how it's become a critical part of the sports broadcast ecosystem. And I'm really, really proud of that journey. I think it's a company that's done really well to build products that meet the needs of the moment. I learned so much about the creator economy, and I think YouTube really pioneered that, the sense of how you empower the individual to become a broadcaster. Sounds very normal now. We're doing it together on this podcast, but was a very, very strange thing beforehand. And so I think the normalcy that YouTube brought to all of that is really impressive. So no, I reflect with nothing but pride, humility for the great colleagues that I got to work with, the great products I was fortunate to be able to bring to market, and just a really good story along the way.
Lately, we've seen sports lean into the platform quite heavily. Obviously, you were going along that journey of trying to get sports to understand the opportunity around a platform like YouTube. And then we see this thing, all that's been happening around these creator economy, the creator-led approach around rights, which we've been talking about a lot this year as well. Is this all really a new evolution from what you saw 8+ years ago, or is it just kind of now it's being unlocked because this has always kind of been what's been happening, let's say, behind the scenes, at least from sports' lens behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. I think the very first conversations we had with partners back in 2017, 2018 were pointing towards this direction. And it was when I first joined that we had the deal with BT Sports to stream the men's Champions League final on YouTube. And at the time, that felt very avant-garde and points to something which now is much more normal. You know, traditional organizations leaning into social media to stream is not a surprise anymore, but it was then. And so in some senses, it was a continuation of what we promised at the start, and organizations maybe woke up to it a bit, or got comfortable, woke up is a bit aggressive maybe, but got comfortable with the benefits. But in other ways, there was evolutions in the product that met the needs of the sports market, that meant the product did change and did become much more useful. When I joined YouTube, there wasn't a TV app. And now we're talking about YouTube as a TV dominant platform. So there was a sense of the market came towards YouTube, but also YouTube came towards the market. And so my gig at YouTube, much like it is at Meta, is not only how do we bring the best of the platform to the industry, but how do we also advocate for the industry internally and make sure that product teams, engineering teams, marketing teams, whoever they are, understand what it takes to build a really good fan experience. And so there's always that two sides to the job. And I think we did that really well at YouTube to develop a product that met the needs of the sports market, whether it was around live streaming or channel memberships or primetime channels, like things that were made for premium content, were things that we really pushed for sports.
Now, reflecting back, when I talk to people in the industry, particularly those that have worked with YouTube, they definitely mention you, Robin, as being a key driver to help get them to where they needed to get to. It comes up quite a lot. So kudos to you and what you've done there. I'm curious as to what are some of those. I think sometimes it might be misunderstood, particularly whether it be in your new role or even at YouTube, how complex it is. That you kind of, I'm not sure, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but you have to somewhere between like a politician, maybe a bit of sales in there, someone who's also a product guy. You've got to kind of wear lots of different hats. Just how difficult was that in those early stages, particularly perhaps before where it's now quite a mature platform, to try and bounce between sports properties and platinum broadcasters back to YouTube, bouncing to and forth, I guess, to try and find that right equilibrium or balance to make sure everyone can understand the opportunity in front of them?
Yeah, it is complex. And I think those are very kind words, but it was more than just about me. There's a great team behind all of that at YouTube, and many of those that are continuing to lead great things. I know you had Johnny Keogh speak at your event recently, and I was fortunate to have some good leaders that gave me the opportunity to run with stuff in sport. But I think it is complex, and it is a really unique role. And I think sometimes when I'm asked about what it is that I did at YouTube or what we'll be doing in Meta, it can be hard to concretely explain it, because you don't necessarily fit into business development. You don't necessarily fit into product development. There's kind of aspects of all that I think people are waking up to understanding that in the tech ecosystem that exists. We hired a lot for factors such as navigating through ambiguity was a really big one for cross-functional skills. So people that could step into a room with products and speak their language, but then equally step into a room with marketing and understand what it is they needed. And so those became things that we really built the team for and had to be fluent at navigating. I think translation became a big part of it. So how do we take these products that are being developed and make them work for sport? How do you take those to the industry and explain why they're important? But equally, you talk about the industry, we were working, and we still do, at this intersect of, it might be a small or niche creator all the way up to the likes of a big federation like a FIFA. And so the conversation pivots every time you have it. And so I think flexibility is really, really key amongst all of that. And again, just a sense of being very, very attuned to what it is that each team across YouTube, across Google wanted to get from the sports industry so that we could position that with partners. So lots of malleability, I think, amongst that.
I imagine. Last question before we move on to the Meta new chapter. Can you give us one or multiple major wins and perhaps a challenge or a surprise or a disappointment that maybe you faced while you were there?
Yeah. So wins, I think putting EMEA Sport, so all the partners that came from our region, on the map globally for YouTube and for Google was not easy. And so again, explaining the value of global football to the organization and delivering that through things like the Women's Champions League deal we did with DAZN and UEFA, which I was particularly proud of us pulling off because we brought women's sport to a whole new audience. The Champions League example for the men's format with BT Sport was, again, really, really powerful in showing how we could work with the broadcast industry. I think I was always very proud of the democracy we were able to drive as well. So this idea that that any creator, small or large, could really grow within YouTube. I mean, people like Robbie from Arsenal Fan TV having a global platform and then getting a TV deal with Channel 4. Or you may remember we had at one of our events World Chase Tag, this new sport at the time.
Love that sport. That's great.
Yeah, that started on YouTube and it ended up on telly. I really love those stories. I love the democratizing power of YouTube giving creators a chance to build their own businesses on YouTube that wouldn't have been possible in the past, or for fans to be able to watch sports that they may not have been able to do if it was all on pay TV or all on broadcast. So I think that was really powerful, and yeah, we took that really, really far. I think challenges wise, there were a few. I think we realized how hard premium content was to land on the platform. So we talked about some of those developments, dynamic ad insertion, primetime channels, but I think they've got a lot more growth to come. But it's really, really hard to host premium live sport on a platform, especially when you yourself are hosting it. And this was the beauty of working with broadcasters, was it was much easier to let them run and use YouTube as the platform than us to host, first party. I think was one big learning. And I think Meta went through and Facebook went through that learning as well. I think the challenge around athletes, building a platform where athletes can easily run their own channels, was always one we found hard at YouTube. YouTube's hard work. You run a YouTube channel, you'll understand it's not easy. And I think for a lot of athletes, that doesn't come naturally. So we always had these athletes that were, by exception, had production teams behind them, or people like Ben Foster or Tom Daly, who are really passionate about video production, but they were the exception. So I think that was a big challenge for me to try and navigate. And then I think at a company level, and this is where it starts to bleed in some of the appeal of Meta, is the difference between consumption and connection. How do you create content that's being talked about, discussed, shared, is an experience that's much more natural on the Meta suite of apps than it is on YouTube. And that was always a desire, I think. How do you show up at a large cultural moment like a World Cup or an Olympics and be the topic of conversation and drive conversation, was a little bit harder on a platform that was more lean back and less native for discussion and so on. So there were some of the headwinds we faced, but so many wins and so many tailwinds for the business.
Well, look, I mean, congratulations again for what you achieved there. As I followed the journey of not only YouTube, but indeed what you've achieved when you were in the company, and have set up really well to see it grow and take on a new level of importance in the sports industry, as we've seen. But one of the most interesting things, I think, in the wider sports media ecosystem today has been Meta's role and place in how it's connecting audiences. And that's as good a segue as I can do. I know Chris, who's should be back on the airwaves early in January. But it is a natural, a fascinating topic, Meta in general terms, for me, because there has so many different parts to the ecosystem that Meta operates. And it's really the connective tissue, I think, to fans between those live matches and content especially. But we're going to talk a little bit more about, obviously, your new role there, and indeed what some of those platforms are really doing to power sports and sports fandom across the industry. So firstly, why did you make that shift to Meta a few months ago?
Yeah, I think one of them was simply change is good. And I've been at YouTube for a while, right? And so the appeal of doing something new, working with new products, new forms of social media beyond video, was particularly exciting for me. It's a bigger business, Meta, whether you frame it on revenue or audience or the number of apps you get to work with, is just bigger than YouTube. And so there's more opportunity there for me to be able to influence. So that was exciting. I think sport, or I know sport, is very much at the core of Meta's business at the moment as well. So if you look even in the last year, you've seen a Meta that has pivoted towards having a very all-encompassing deal with the UFC. We have Dana White on the board of the company. And as of the last month, when we launched the Oakley Meta Vanguard product, which is the sort of wraparound, more sports glasses, we've become a sports fashion company overnight. And so it feels a lot more intrinsic to the company mission to get sport right. And that made the role personally really, really appealing for me. So yeah, there's a few factors that went into it, but it was definitely the right time and the right moment and the right business.
You've been brought in to lead sport across EMEA. What's the mandate you've been given basically to lead? Is it a similar type of connective tissue between sports and many different platforms? Is there some specific objectives you're setting out to achieve? What is the mandate you've been given?
It's similar to what we talked about earlier. It's always difficult to explain, but I'll give it my best shot. There's the point of bringing the expertise from the industry to the company, especially in EMEA, where we don't have enough of that at the moment, of how we succeed in things like global football or Formula One, which my team run globally for Meta. There's the partnerships work. So, myself and the team manage the top partners from around the region across all those sectors that we talked about. So broadcasters, leagues, teams, the athletes is such a really, really important part of the business here, and where a lot of focus is as well. It has that cross-functional aspect. So my team are responsible for delivering the mission of the product and engineering team. So when we develop stuff that we think will work in the sports market, our job is to make sure that it works. We give feedback and then we bring it to market and execute. To do the deals with partners, to make sure they're bringing the content to those products across the different business lines. And I can go into a bit more detail of what that looks like for each business. But also maybe bigger here is the serving of marketing functions. So our team are the ones that do the sponsorship deals. So bringing the opportunities to the business of where Meta can grow its advocacy with the industry is something that we execute for the business by knowing who are the partners, who we should be looking at, where are the opportunities, what are the terms that matter to us. So that's a really big part of the role. My team's worked on 2 big deals this year, which have been firstly having Kylian Mbappe feature as the face really of the Oakley launch that we had this year, and also the deal that we had for Meta AI to sponsor Mercedes. So we know we want to do more in the sports space. The fans that sports has can help drive advocacy for Meta products, and so that's a big part of the role as well. And then also, I think part of the mandate is developing the strategy. So where should we be taking sports within Meta? Where should we go in the industry? And so I've been spending time with the team the last few months figuring out what that 3-year plan looks like. And that's tricky because Meta changes so quickly. And this is something I definitely wanted to talk about, is how often we're building new products, new experiences, and the company almost changes every 6 months. And so it's hard to build that strategy. And I think sometimes partners can feel on the pointy end of that when there are shifts in what's important. And part of that is the education of partners staying with us and staying with the overall mission of driving a connected future for sports fans, and not being too worried about the static playbook of how to achieve it right now, but working with us continuously on what are the new products and what are the new opportunities. So quite a broad answer, but if I was to put it in a nutshell, it's help Meta succeed in the sports industry, help the sports industry succeed with Meta, and lead the partnerships and deals that enable that.
Quite a big remit. I'm curious what you found initially in the initial months anyway of sports perception, perhaps, of Meta. There's lots of different ways you can look at that, obviously, because Meta is not Meta the brand, and then obviously all the constituting parts underneath that. How have you found those initial conversations with probably, no doubt, existing contacts you've got across the industry?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I think the main feedback from partners is they see us as indispensable, certainly on certain product lines, that is really critical to their business, but sometimes that Meta can be inscrutable. And so what is it that Meta stands for in sport, or where is it the direction's going? I think we have a great partnerships team that's been out there doing that and explaining, but my job's to help supercharge that and make sure it's really understood for the industry, what it is we're developing, why it matters to them, how they can bring the best partnerships to life with us. And so I think that's been some of the perception, I would suggest, the last year or two, is what does Meta stand for in sport? What is it these guys are trying to build? And so that's a healthy challenge for me to address. And it starts with, our own sports summit, which we hosted last week for the industry, and it'll continue next year with much more of that. So that's, I think, the main perception challenge that I faced so far.
And I guess flipping that question a little bit, what is it from Meta's perspective that's perception of sports? And do they have a really solid understanding, or is there things that you've already had to address early on about trying to bridge that, I guess, that knowledge gap between the sports as an industry, perhaps, versus how Meta operate?
I think back to the point about sport being at the core of the company, it's now recognized much more than it was a couple of years ago, I think, how important sports can be. If you think about the mission of Meta to connect people as a social company, there's a lot of kinship between Meta and the sports industry. All of the mission is to bring people together and create really valuable experiences. And so in that sense, the top lines are really, really aligned. I think when you talk about product adoption and getting people around the world to understand the value of the Meta apps, there's nothing like sport that can do that and bring it to life. We know the reach numbers that sports provides. We know the consideration factors that having an athlete use a new feature on Instagram can drive for the rest of the 3.5 billion people that use Instagram. So it's often a beacon, I think, that shows the rest of the world how these products can be used. I think there's obviously some always education we can do internally at Meta of how the sports industry functions and how it works, and some of the almost the regulations of each of the organizations, how they need to work and where rights are accorded. We work in this industry, Nick, so you and I understand this deeply, but that's not the case for people who have been deep in tech for a long time and haven't worked in the sports industry. So back to that translation point, a lot of it is that as explaining, I think, that sports can be tricky to navigate. There's almost this stormy sea of, hey, if you want to do something with sport, it can be tricky, but that we're almost the navigators as a team that can say, hey, but we can show you the route to get there. I think that's really our value in the organization.
Looking back at let's look at some of the trends that you're following and perhaps seeing since you joined. And obviously you presented a number of insights at the Meta Sports Summit you hosted as we're recording this was last week. So talk me through some of those trends, some of those key points that you shared with the audience. I thought the first one, looking at you were able to share that presentation before we did this, was an interesting take on that, which I'd love you to set the scene, and you're better than that than I am. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I think the goal there was really to show why Meta has become such a big player in the sports industry and so invaluable, like we talked about, to organizations where they use us for growing their audience, growing their business, showing their creativity. Those were the three areas we really talked about. But personally, just looking at some of the trends and tailwinds that I've seen that I think has led to this, there were three that we talked about in detail. So one was the idea of the TV becoming the next generation second screen. And I know this is something you've mentioned as well, Nick, or certainly a provocation of how important is the mobile versus the TV. So in that sense, we've always talked about the mobile as the second screen. So fans are sitting there watching the TV experience of the live game. And then, occasionally they'll be on their phone doing something different. I think if we were taking that to its natural growth, where it either is now at a tipping point or where it could come to, is that if you actually observe sports fans watching a live game on TV, if you observe fans watching a game even in the stadium, a huge amount of time is now being spent on conversing about that game on the phone. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It really amplifies the experience, right? If you're able to take what you're seeing on the TV as a subtext to your conversation with your friends, your family, your colleagues. And so I think it's disingenuous slightly to call the mobile the second screen, because it's become the home of the conversation when you're watching the game itself. So we talked about that, and
I just let's stop on that point for a second. I think for those who have heard me recently, that point is something that I've done at two presentations I've done and keynotes I've done. I made an explicit point about pointing to the fact is it really the first screen anymore? In fact, I do think the mobile is the second screen. No, look, there's always exceptions. There's always certain use cases. And I think moments are where the TV becomes the first screen in those instances when, something's coming to a certain point. But I think you could really argue that sports can at times on the big screen fall into the background in certain times, certain instances, but it doesn't mean they're not massively engaged with that sport either at the time or a fan of that sport in general. It's just the reality of the world we live in. We're always juggling different experiences and very rarely just focused on any one given thing. The only thing that really drives that really well now these days is sports. But it's still going to have to accept, I think once it accepts what you've just talked about, then it's going to be able to approach and manage that so much more effectively than try to create some sort of like pushback against the notion of that mobile phones are a barrier or a negative as part of that experience.
Yeah. It's not that live sport or sport on TV is dying, but it's diffusing, right? It's becoming an amplified experience across devices, and that should be embraced. I think is what you're saying, is which I'd agree with.
Yeah.
And I think that's especially true amongst younger audiences. So we looked at the Ofcom data from this year here in the UK, and we see that younger audiences, I think it's for 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK, 45% of them watch TV weekly. So 55% aren't. And we know that's so much higher for older demographics. So that's one shift. And when these younger demographics are watching TV, they're watching 17 minutes a day. And I remember a time when that was 4 hours, 5 hours, like much, much bigger numbers, even on average. So I think it's pointing to a new direction where we need to be more sophisticated about how we talk about what premium content is in sport. I think it's not as simple as saying there's the live sport, which is incredibly, incredibly valuable and worth billions. And then there's highlights and behind the scenes stuff that we give away. I think we're going to see a reevaluation of what premium is and what it feels like. And while valuations at the moment might point to the pyramid looking like that, so live sport being where the value is, highlights maybe a bit of value that you can sell on, and behind the scenes you give away. If you actually observe behavior, it really, really doesn't feel like that. And we talked about a couple of examples from the last couple of weeks of, if you take the Liverpool-Leeds game, how many people watched it live, how many people watched the highlights, and then how many people were part of the discussion on Mo Salah's interview and Jamie Carragher's reaction, and the sort of back and forth after that is where the conversation is where the culture is. And so what is the premium? What is the bit that really matters? We did the same for Formula One. So how many people watched the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix live? Wasn't particularly a thriller, I don't think. How many people watched the highlights, or was the most important thing that Lando Norris won? Or again, what was being talked about was the celebrations of Lando Norris with his mum, with his dad, the tears, the partying. And so my provocation is around, where is the premium in the rights ecosystem now? Where is the conversation? And if you define the culture as what's being talked about, that I would posit we have an overvaluation on live sport at the moment, and that the rest of this pyramid can become really, really important for younger audiences.
It's an interesting theory, and I am fairly supportive of it. I think the way that you framed it in your presentation was basically it's kind of like live is almost the enabler for the real engagement, rather than people seeing, the industry seeing that live is classified as engagement, everything else is just noise or just secondary fodder to the live experience. And look, there is some value. There is definitely a counter to that. It isn't as simple. Like, I think like you said, we need to be more sophisticated. It's not one or the other, right? Mm-hmm. Live moments drive greater attention, focus of attention, driving higher CPMs of advertisers for a reason. And that's why the sports is getting that support through live more than ever. And you've seen that firsthand across in your previous role. But I've been thinking about this for quite a while as someone who is a big fan of a variety of sports that I very rarely watch live. Sports actually have a challenge where they're not getting enough value out of me being a fan of that sports, taking on that traditional model that sits across. The example I give is my own one, is like NFL and fantasy football. I've been playing fantasy football for 25 years or so, since like before it was a definitely thing in Australia. And the people that are making the most value out of me at the time might have been a Yahoo or a sleeper.com, which I'm using for the sleeper, the content experience. And then the NFL has to find another way to basically get value out of my engagement through those channels. So it's just one of the many examples of all these. I think you framed it in your presentation, probably the simple one is like behind the scenes. It's just all the the other stuff going on around the action that is really driving the fan engagement, not just the live sporting experience. So I don't know if you want to add anything further to that, but that's kind of how I think it's a huge challenge we've got to face.
The way you put it is exactly the way I see it. It's not either or. And I'm not here to say TV's dying, live sports dying. I'm a huge believer it's still very, very valuable. But I think it's disingenuous to the other formats to say that it's the only place that drives value. And what will be interesting is exactly your point of how, as a rights holder, do I monetize and commercialize all those other parts, which we at Meta are trying to figure out. You know, my insinuation is that the other parts are really what's being played out across the Meta suite of apps, knowing that we have tried live sport and that it didn't work for a number of reasons. And so the theory here and my strategy here is own the conversation, don't rent the rights. And that's something we're going to try and build towards and try and build value for partners in all those other formats. I had an interesting conversation a few weeks ago around if you were building a new sport now, knowing that the pyramid was, live rights at the top, worth billions, sort of locked away. Highlights, maybe you give away a bit, but you find a way to monetize it. And behind the scenes, you fully give away. Would you even flip that pyramid for younger audiences? Would you give away some of the live sport to get them interested? But if they want to watch it all, well, you should pay for a highlight service that lets you be the catch-up master. And then at the very top, if you want to know more about the athletes, the drivers, the players, the Drive to Survive phenomenon, that's where your subscription lives. It would be very interesting to see if rights holders take that approach. I think Kings League may have taken a sort of approach within this, but I'm interested to see what comes up for new sports that are being developed over the next few years.
Yeah, it's something I've, in one of the presentations I've done recently, I again made the point around that I think any launching competition or new league coming to market should just actively avoid the idea of trying to chase media rights checks and limiting audience, and embrace visibility and access across every platform they can, and then use that as the tool, the source, the secret source, etc., to drive the commercial value. The tricky part of all that is it's still relatively, not say unproven, but there is few examples that we can point to yet where that has been achieved at the top end. At the lower end, there's some ones you can start to point to as that are on a journey and that are progressing in the right direction. And but at the top end, it's still all built around that media rights check being paid out. And so sports is going to have to go through some transition at some stage along the way, which I'm sure, I think anecdotally you should keep a counter at the office of how many times you get asked to buy media rights in your new role, irrespective of what you're working on. But yeah, I think it's an interesting evolution that's going to have to happen. And Meta clearly has a lot of different tools in play that lean into that sort of fandom quite closely. I want to talk about another trend and move on a little bit, which is that you talk about the rise of individual alongside the institution, I think is the way you phrased it. Just talk about, this is obviously linking to the athlete economy or creator economy that you mentioned earlier. Talk about what you were referencing there.
The power of the individual is not just a sports phenomenon. So you can take a variety of industries where it's become clear that the individual has grown in prominence, not necessarily beyond the institution, but has grown in prominence, sometimes at an equal footing. So the example I use is if you take music and you look through the Billboard Top 100 or choose your favorite ranking system. This year was the year that, for a while we've had a mixture of groups, bands, and we've had individual solo artists. And this year we had the first top 100 where there were no groups, zero, all solo artists. And so that's music. You can take that as one trend. And I think the stat was 8% of the top 10 over the last 7 years have been groups. The rest has all been individuals. So that's one one aspect or one trend. If you take gaming, people are watching streamers more than they're playing the games.
Yeah.
So again, another flip. If you take news, people are following journalists as much as they're following the publishers. And so there's a variety of different industries where we see this happen. And I think sports example clearly is the athletes having a bigger voice, a bigger pattern amongst all of that. And that's become really, really powerful on Meta platforms where 1.5 million professional athletes have an Instagram account. And 1 in 3 people that come to Instagram, that's 3.5 billion monthly active users, are coming to watch athlete content. And so just alone, you can make the assumption that there's a billion monthly active user platform for athletes. And that's obviously something that Meta has really leaned into, that for me is going to be an important part of the strategy, is how do we serve that connection directly between athletes and fans, as well as the media companies, the broadcasters, the leagues, the teams. And now it's not to say that it's going to replace it in any way. Again, much like the TV and live sport versus mobile behind the scenes debate, it's additive, it's sophisticated, and there's no neat answer for organizations. But I would say for these organizations and institutions to lean into that trend, hand over the reins a little bit more to creators, to athletes, and worry less about winning, for example, the copyright battle and winning the culture war. And the culture war will be won by embracing these individuals and having them front of your video, front of your communications, giving them access to highlights, for example, so they can distribute, to grow your brand as a whole, is going to be the big trend, I think.
So you already answered this question a little bit already, but I'm curious, though, what does the institution have to do? You've given a sense that, yeah, maybe opening up the rights, but I feel if I was in the shoes of clubs and leagues and competitions, I'd be getting quite nervous about the notion that all the people we're trying to serve are now going to be kind of more powerful than us in a way in terms of driving audience and so forth. Is it simply just, are you saying just embrace the fact that this is the case rather than trying to push back it and trying to protect your walled garden, and instead just completely, again, it's almost like the whole conversation might be going this way, but flip your mindset, flip your perception of this and open up the floodgates to your athletes. But I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, but how are we going to make bang for our buck here if we give all the tools to those athletes who might be moving on and leave us in a year or two? How do you manage that, navigate that if you're a league or a club?
I completely understand the challenge and the frustration. You know, it's competitive for eyeballs, it's competitive for revenue, and so it feels, I think, like you're handing a big win to these others at the cost of yourself. And maybe it's the battle between short-term eyeballs and revenue versus long-term growth amongst the audiences you care about. And I think this is one of my bigger challenges working in this space for a long time, and people have heard me talk about this, is how can I help you understand the long-term benefits? How can we measure that, even though I know some of the advice is going to be tough in the short run? And I think the brands and the organizations that have lent in and understood that are now reaping the rewards of it and slowly seeing the value of it. We talk about a World Cup being streamed by Kazi TV. You know, the fact that you were brave enough to have a creator host your rights would have been unthinkable years ago. But now look at the value that's getting in Brazil. Kazi TV has grown an incremental audience on top of Globo, and now is doing that with other properties. And it's a fantastic story, but it does take time, and it may take months, it may take years to do. So I think embrace it, yes, but figure out how you can collaborate. How can you also get value from the athlete's own channels and the creator's own channels that drive back to you? You know, the collaboration doesn't have to be one way. It doesn't mean just giving your content to, you know, this athlete and then post it, but also how can you get their channel to launch your new kit? How can you get their channel to sell your tickets for the game? How can you get their channel to stream your rights and grow your numbers overall? How can you do a rev share with these creators or athletes so that you're getting your fair share? So again, it all comes back to sophistication, and it really isn't easy, but the organizations that are brave, that are forward thinking, that do some thinking on what this new model could look like will get there. And initially it does sound scary. But again, I come back to that analogy of like, are you winning a short-term battle, but losing the long-term culture war? And that's something I would be thinking about very, very carefully if I was an organization at the moment. And maybe it's also taking parallels from those other industries. What does music do? Well, you know, music really welcomes collaboration. You know, you release a piece of music, somebody joins in and spins it up and edits it, and it gets bigger. If you're the label, how do you put your artist front and center? So there's lots that sports can learn from music in that sense.
So let's move the conversation on now to platform specific rather than talking Meta as a holistic brand and company. let's go through maybe one by one. Which one is basically good for what? You've got Facebook, you've got Instagram, you've got the hardware side, you've got Meta AI now, WhatsApp and Threads. They all clearly serve and do different things in the day-to-day lives of users. Some crossover, no doubt. Just maybe whichever order you'd like to go through, let's maybe rattle through as quickly or as long as you want to spend on each one of them on its role and what it does for sports.
All of the businesses are very interconnected. And so you can approach the Meta suite of apps as a place where you can achieve lots of different things and you can drive people from one place to another. So they're siloed in one sense, but they're also very, very connected. And they're all trying to drive the same thing, social connection, the connection between AI and the individual. So all of them have similar themes. Facebook itself is a mature business, but it still has, over 3 billion people coming and using its service every day. And I think in some markets, we don't feel how powerful it's become because take the UK, for example, it may feel that Instagram's now a much more popular social app amongst certain demographics. But if you look at the rest of the world, it's still the primary way of accessing the internet in certain markets, in India, in Africa. So there's a great opportunity for sports organizations to grow using Facebook. And so a lot of the conversations we have with sports organizations are about using Facebook to extend audience. It's also great for direct monetization. A lot of our story is of course not driving towards an immediate short-term check, but thinking about the long-term value of growing your audience. But Facebook does provide that short-term check, and it's pretty impressive. So this year, the team unified the monetization across all the different types of content you can post on Facebook, including photos, etc., and then gives you a payout across all of those. And those payouts are becoming really significant for teams, where it makes them not a cost center, not an expense, but actually can make money back. So Facebook really, really offers that. There's also a big drive underway to make Facebook cool again and relevant again with younger audiences. And I think it's recognized that it needs to do that and evolve. So if you listen to some of the product teams here, they're thinking about what those features might be, leaning into a legacy heritage of being about connecting real people. Is still the only social platform where people really use their proper name, where you're willing to go meet somebody you've met on Marketplace to exchange or go to their house and sell something. Like there's something really special there about it's very trusted and very human. And so that relevancy play is something that's going to be ongoing. We've seen it from the pivot towards Reels on Facebook, much as we've seen the success of short form video on Instagram. So you'll see lots more in that space. And so Facebook shouldn't be forgotten as kind of the original product. It's still very much at the core. And I've certainly learned a lot since coming here about that one. Jump in if you want.
I was just going to say, it's been interesting actually since I actually left the UK. And I've been in a couple of countries, traveled a bit as well, to see how prevalent and how prominent and how important Facebook is in the lives of many people that I've seen in the countries I've been to. I think it is lost on people. They get a very tunnel vision view of their own life and their own use, and therefore expect that the whole world operates like them. Anecdotally, when I was living in Jamaica, pretty much every touch point I had with people was through a Meta platform, which kind of was quite a surprise, whether it would be Instagram, WhatsApp, or Facebook. There was nothing else. There was no websites. The average website I went to was updated at the beginning of COVID and had, with still the disclaimer at the start of COVID of like, we're closed because of COVID or what have you, and never been updated since. And that was happening all across the whole ecosystem. So it showed that the Meta ecosystem, because of its, I guess, ease of use for people and perhaps the official nature of how people are able to sign up and so forth, definitely made it a trusted platform, particularly in developing countries and other markets that maybe people discount just because they don't live in them.
I think that's completely right. So there's huge value that sports organizations see from that. I mean, if you talk to any sports organization, they're looking to grow international audience, and Facebook's a great fit for that. Everyone wants to make some form of direct revenue, and it provides that. So there's those two. And then I think the story will be around how we grow that younger relevance. The latest stat I saw was that for 5 quarters in a row, the number of younger people using Facebook, so I think under 24s, has grown. And it's something like 40 million across the US and Canada. But it's a big audience that is, I think, a bit undervalued. maybe because of the prominence of Instagram and how successful that's been. So that's Facebook. Instagram's the obvious next logical place to talk about. The positioning there for the app is very much around the home of creativity. Do it anyway is the strapline of the latest campaign that we've done, and we've worked with some sports partners on this one as well. And most people are more familiar with this one, but it's really become, going back to my earlier point, the pivot of conversational media, and the power is the DM. So teenagers in the US are sending 30 DMs a day with content in them. So it's become a real platform for them where they're having discussion. More content now is shared, more videos are now shared in the DMs, in the messages, than are shared to stories, and more are shared to stories than the feed. And so I think one of the trends that we've picked up on is that media has evolved in the sense of there was a publisher or a TV channel that had a commissioner or an editor that said, you should watch this will be good for you. So then the feed experience where the algorithm was king, which is based on what you've already watched, here's what you should watch next. And then I think the third shift that we're going through is then this conversational media shift of, through the power of things like the DM on Instagram, what is it that your friends are consuming and watching and they've sent you because they want to spark a discussion and not a lonely, isolated view, but something you can talk about, is, I think, the next powerful shift. And if I think about my own usage, that's where a lot of it comes from, is the group chats on Instagram or on WhatsApp, which we'll talk about. So for Instagram, it's really all about creativity. It's a video platform now. It's over half the time is being spent watching videos. So that's obviously the big shift that it's undergone from being a photo sharing app to a video app. It's now launching on TVs, which was the news that we shared yesterday. So people are going to be able to consume Instagram on their TVs with a neat experience, much like YouTube, of different user profiles, etc., with search functionality. And I think that's going to be really exciting for where Instagram can go next. People were always surprised when I told them that the YouTube app on TV launched in 2018. It's quite recent, really, when you think about how big that's grown. And so I think looking at that, the Instagram product team have seen an opportunity to have more of a lean back experience on YouTube on the TV for Instagram.
Interesting on the IGTV, when I saw the announcement, I felt like it was one of those ones that you kind of think it's fairly inevitable this is happening. It's just a matter of when. The question I think most people will come to is, obviously Instagram is a leading vertical video experience. How does that translate to a TV experience? Have you got any idea of how that will play out? Because you talked about using Reels as the fuel, the power of content consumption on the platform.
The big driver, the comparison for me, is YouTube Shorts. We were always stunned at YouTube of how much people were watching Shorts on their telly. And it was I don't have the exact numbers, but it was a huge driver of that living room growth, was people using their remote to flick through Shorts. And that, again, was unthinkable. People thought, well, why would you watch that on your TV, the kind of vertical format with a background? But they did, and they loved it. And maybe the comparison is that what people are doing is watching a reel and sharing it to their friend, or even sometimes their partner who might be sat next to them, versus having a shared experience of, let's watch this together. And it feels strange to us because it's not the world we've grown up in. Let's watch on the TV together these long 2-3 hour epic movies. But I think for younger people, that won't be the case. It'll feel very normal to just consume the content where you are. So it's very much a test. It's on the Amazon Fire Stick at the moment, and plans to roll it out further. But I think a lot of the feeling at Instagram is, let's see where it goes and let's see what trends we pick up on people using them.
I think it's one of those things that when I saw it, I'm like, this will do well. My question is, will it do well enough for Meta? Because I think for anyone launching a platform with the scalability and the breadth of content that Instagram has on, say, on file, so to speak, or access to, will that translate to enough value for Meta to make it worthwhile? And that's why you're testing it, I guess, on Fire TV to begin with. But it'll be definitely interesting and exciting extension of reach for Instagram. Now, let's move things on a little bit, because I think let's maybe go to WhatsApp next, because I think that's probably the most obvious next step. Talk us through how, particularly from the lens of maybe whether it's use, whether it's sports, just what do you see WhatsApp as?
I think WhatsApp has huge opportunity. And it's one where you speak to sports fans, and you'll probably be the same as me, Nick. You'll have a group chat with people discussing a certain sport or a certain club, and they can be the home of where people are actually consuming sport on the day or during the live game. WhatsApp has 3 billion users worldwide. So again, huge platform. And the updates tab, which is where you have your channels, where organizations can share content directly, has 1 billion monthly active users. So that is becoming a really, really big part of the service for sports organizations. They can share content in there, and then you can share it with your chat group. And I think philosophically that the importance of the chat group is becoming bigger and bigger. Most people have them now and use them. And I think it's the difference between maybe an isolated viewing experience or an experience that you can have with others, and that currency of being able to share it. We've talked before about a share in the WhatsApp group for your video piece of content is worth 1,000 likes. And I think that's really powerful. Like when you take ownership and you tokenize the content and say, hey, this is a bit of us, or this is something that's really, really awesome for your friends, family, whatever, it takes on a whole new life and becomes a bit more important than just something you're being served by the algorithm. So I think obviously WhatsApp doesn't have that many monetization features at the moment. Partners are using it to drive traffic referral. Of all the Meta apps, it's probably the biggest traffic referrer. So it sends people on elsewhere. So if you want to sell tickets, if you want to sell merchandise, it's a great place to be able to do it.
With WhatsApp, one of the challenges that I've understood, maybe this is incorrect, Rob, but is the difficulty on the visibility of use on platform for those publishing on it. Is there's other than say referral, because you can see obviously track links going to traditional website platforms and the like. Is there any insight and data you're able to share with, let's say, a sports property that they can lean into to give them a guide of how well it's performing, that maybe perception might be that they can't get access to anything?
Yeah, I think it's a reason my team exists. We can share a little bit more about what we're seeing of how it's trending. I think you have to remember that if you take the company view and the philosophy of the product and why it's been so successful, WhatsApp is all about privacy. It's the number one reason that around the world people have chosen to use WhatsApp is because of the fact it's private, it's encrypted. We don't particularly share much from it. And so there aren't that kind of open analytics of you posted this Arsenal kit launch here. All of these people have sent it to their groups and talked about it in this way. And it's that balance. You know, if we did that, there'd be the criticism for, well, actually, no, it's no longer private, and everyone would move to a different app. So I think that's the really tough thing for the WhatsApp team that is on us to try and navigate and make that case that, you know, sports organizations need that data. But for now, the message would be, while there aren't the kind of open source analytics, leagues, teams, clubs, athletes can work with us to try and understand how content's moving. So hopefully that makes sense.
Now let's talk about Threads, because that's the new-ish kid on the block, I suppose you would call it. I saw some interesting numbers in your presentation. Talk us through where Threads sits in the landscape.
Yeah, Threads is, I think you've got it exactly right. It's the new platform. It's the fastest growing platform. And it's really punching its weight amongst the other social apps. I think people are less familiar with the benefits of Threads. So we spent a lot of time at our event last week on that. Having said that, for a new platform, it's grown really, really quickly in just a few years. So 400 million monthly active users now on the platform, 150 million of those coming daily. And as we head towards the World Cup, we're really trying to build out the football ecosystem on there with partners to make sure we've got a great level of conversation. Differences between X, Twitter, which is the obvious comparison point. I think the product team are trying to build something that's very, very conversational. It's very, very text-based. It's not a home for video. We don't want it to become another video platform. So that's interesting for a lot of people to hear. And we want it to be a place of positive conversation, which I think is what the world needs across a variety of vectors right now. And so a lot of what you'll see on there is quite positive debate, still spicy, still edgy, but not toxic. Like we know that these forums can slip into if you're not careful and you don't curate it well. So Threads is really exciting. Formula One is the biggest ecosystem community that we have on Threads, and it's doing really well. So I would point sports organizations to go and look at what they're doing well, all the teams, all the drivers, the federation itself. It's got really, really nice feeling during a race weekend when you open the app. So we're really excited about where Threads can go next, but it's obviously still on a growth journey.
In the F1 example that you just shared, how did it get to that place? Was it something that Meta had to really work with them on to and get all stakeholders on board? Was it something that's happened organically over time?
It's a really good point. And obviously a lot of this has been before my time and sort of arriving here. You just notice how big it is compared to any other sport. But I think there's been a lot of investment in the ecosystem of working with the federations on the benefits and the drivers and getting them to use it to the extent where drivers have left other platforms and come to Threads, Lando Norris being one. Maybe it's slightly easier because the ecosystem's a bit smaller in terms of the number of players you need to make it successful. Maybe because it leans a bit tech heavy and there's an overlap there with motor racing and F1 that we've seen before. But yeah, there's a few ingredients that are making it well. As much as I'd like for our team to take all the credit of working with all the partners to get them on, I think there's something that intuitively feels right between the two. But like I say, next up football, we want to do so much more in that space next year, and partners can expect to hear more from us and how we're developing new features for that, be it, I don't know, IP, scores, features for conversation in the global football space.
Now, there's a few other sort of, well, you've got feathers to the cap of Meta, whether it be AI, whether it be the wearables and the hardware side. Should we start with the AI IPs? That was one of the things listed on your presentation.
Yeah, you can't not have a conversation about AI right in this day and age. But Meta's approach to AI is very different to a lot of the other platforms. And so if you look at a Gemini or a ChatGPT, it's about productivity. It's about having a really, really smart intern almost that can help you with tasks. And Meta don't want to play in that space. The Meta approach is all about personal super intelligence. What does that mean? It's almost like having the best personal secretary you could have. So someone that really understands you, your connections, your favorite teams, your club, what you've talked about, and then being able to serve you onwards. And I think that's the Meta USP, is that it can offer that through the apps that it has. In terms of how that plays out, there's a couple of places. So there's the Meta AI app, which at the moment is for things like media generation, using templates where you can edit and create content and bring that to Instagram. Then there's the wearables, where it's being deployed as AI as hardware, which we'll talk about in a second. But again, I think partners can expect to hear a lot more from us on AI. And just generally, AI is thought about as a layer on top of all the other products. So how in WhatsApp are you able to use it to fuel your conversation and give you the right answers? How are you able to better serve ads on Instagram or target reels to the right person at the right time? So think about it almost as a layer, and then there is the AI app, and that'll become more powerful and useful over time.
Interesting. Let's go to the hardware side. I did see the new sunglasses that you mentioned. There's the Vanguards, you called them, I think, earlier, and they are very impressive looking kit or looking fashion glasses, I have to say. Talk us through all of that.
Where to begin, really? I think this is the most exciting. I was kind of left it till last, but I think there's so much more we could talk about with the sports industry on this. I think it's the product that puts us much more squarely in the industry, and a lot of the kind of sponsorship deals we want to do are around bringing those glasses to market. I think if you look at the trend of technology, which I like to do, and we've mentioned it here, you can think about technology as always trying to become more frictionless over time. So the analogy is that we used to carry around clocks in our pocket, and eventually they moved onto our wrists and so on and so forth. And the same is what is being posited with the glasses and computing. So rather than having this glass brick that maybe gets in the way or stands between you and what you're trying to watch in the stadium or connect with a friend, that you could have a more frictionless way, be it a whisper in the ear or having a camera that sees what you see and knows when the right moment to intervene is going to be powerful. And that applies for both the Ray-Bans, which are much more of a fashion product or a day-to-day. For somewhere like Sweden, where there's much less light, you can have the transition, so it's also clear. I think that makes it much more useful. And then the products that we're developing with Oakley, so the Vanguard being the latest release, is much more of a sports performance product. So the team have dubbed it Athletic Intelligence, which means if you are a weekend warrior or a budding sports enthusiast, you can have this personal coach in your ear that links to your Garmin and your Strava and gives you information to make you feel more equipped to tackle whatever you're tackling. It records really high quality video. It can stand up to conditions, snow, storms, whatever. And so this is like the first iteration of a sports glasses product, and you can imagine where it will go next. But we're really, really excited. I'm personally excited about the opportunity for wearables as a kind of AI hardware product, and that feels very, very natural to sport. We'll try and work with the athlete ecosystem to make sure that it's adopted in a really authentic way. So knowing the product came out last month, we're about to see, I think, an explosion of content on things like Instagram with whole new points of view of sport. So you can just imagine, pick your favorite sport, how they might be used to show an angle that's never been shown before. Or even we've thought about, would you have referees wearing them so they can show you what it's like to be that close to the action? The mind boggles with where it can go. But again, new product, we're about to witness how users are going to use them, much as when we launched mobiles, it launched whole different things like selfie videos and so on. So it'll be interesting to see what content is made with the glasses, and then in turn, how we can develop that with the sports industry. So really excited about the potential for wearables.
No, the vanguards they bring me back to my childhood a little bit. I remember when the M frame, I think they were called, the Oakley M frames, which is the big wraparound sunglasses, first came out. I remember all the cricketers when I was a kid were wearing them. I was like, oh, they look so awesome. And now, who would have thought that they are basically this incredible piece of technology now that I can't see how they're not heavily adopted over time by, whether it be, like you said, sports enthusiasts to professional athletes and training and content creators, and you kind of name it. It seems like they are built to, if you haven't seen them, please make sure you go check them out. They just look like a regular pair of sunglasses that someone would wear, that I see running past me every day. And now they might have Meta AI in their ear. It's a pretty incredible experience to see that come to life. What you said you're looking at to bring that into sports more closely, create more education. Where is it, just to become part of the ecosystem, to become adopted by users and consumers on scale? Do you think that it's going to be far away from potentially being linked with a live broadcast? Is that something that is on the cards in the foreseeable future? Just where do you think some of those applications might go, considering I know it's only early stages?
Sure. Well, let's take each sector of the sports industry. So for, call it broadcasts and leagues, I think we do want to get to a place where you're able to live stream with them, and that could give you a different point of view. It's been called an empathy engine. So if you can see from a player's point of view how they play, how they train, you have a whole new empathy for what it feels like to be that athlete in the moment. So I think that's the obvious place to start, is almost a broadcast version. And so at the moment, a lot of our conversations are working with organizations to get them the glasses and get them producing content and seeing what works, almost an add-on to what they're doing with cameras and phones. I think for the athletes, there's everything from training through to a lifestyle play of just showing, their point of view or what it's like to train. And then there's the fan point of view, which is how can you create content of your experience going to the stadium in a way that's much more seamless than having to keep getting your phone out and look distracted, versus being able to sit and watch the game and every now and then, record a piece of content and tokenize that experience for yourself in a way that's really natural, so that afterwards you can look back on it and say, that was really meaningful. And as we add more features, you can think about it as how it can enhance the live sports viewing experience. So could you have an example where you're in the stadium and you're able to look at a player and see their stats on top? If you're sat at the wrong end of the stadium to where the action is, could you zoom in and have a much better viewing experience? So I think the potential there for all of the segments is real. A lot of our time at the moment is obviously being spent with the first two, so the media companies and the athletes, and coaching them on, in the short term, how they can just start creating new points of view content. The fans are loving. So the few athletes we have done stuff with, that you can see on Instagram, and there's quite a lot around the Ashes actually. You mentioned cricket, but we have a deal in place with Australia Cricket. They're making fantastic content. And Stuart Broad, who's there from an England point of view, covering everything, they're making some really nice content with it. So I think as people see them and then they'll want to adopt them themselves and make their own, it could be the wave of content that we saw when mobile phones first came out. I mean, these things are already selling at the rate of the first generation iPhone. So there's a comparison there of how they can potentially grow. But it's early days. These are the first iterations of this, and I'm sure there's much more to come.
A lot of intrigue, a lot of excitement, but also has been met with some mixed reaction by consumers because of the notion of being filmed. Say unwillingly or unknowingly has always been a concern. How has that been? I guess evolved. Obviously, you only been in the company for a few months, but I imagine, like any new tech, that the comfort level has improved over time. And obviously, with the cameras, it is typically quite visible that someone has turned their camera capabilities on. But have you found it to be an ongoing challenge to, I guess, get people to embrace it, or is it not as big as some people might think?
I think it's a challenge across all of the new technologies. And I think Meta faces this particularly because the experiences and tech it's trying to develop is not necessarily copying what has already been done, like the broadcast industry. But if you think about the genesis of Facebook, of Instagram, of WhatsApp, most of these were new technologies that people hadn't thought of. It wasn't a case of, well, TV's digitizing, let's make an app that helps that. It's let's make something new. And when you make something new, there are sometimes moments where you get it wrong, or consumers don't understand it, or bad actors especially can capitalize on it and use it really quickly before regulations have been put in place. So I had a really interesting conversation when I first joined with the integrity team at Meta, who the team that look after a lot of these responsibility issues. And they talked about exactly this, that when new technology comes out, there's a lot of moral panic or a lot of concern of how it will be used. And sometimes there's a little bit of a lag between the technology and the rules in place to develop that. So they talked about cars. And when cars came out and there's a shift from kind of horse and cart to cars, there were no rules. People could drive at any age and wherever and under any level of alcohol. And then we introduced rules to make it safe. And I think that's what Meta's trying to be much more careful on with these products now, is when we launch them, making sure these things are in place. So the good example with the wearables is, the light comes on when you're filming. If you try and cover the light with a piece of paper, it won't work. So there's things built in place to make sure that that it's used for the right reasons. But I think it's something Meta faces a lot more than other companies because it's pushing out new technology. It's the tough bit of the gig. But I would say from the inside here that it is taken seriously. And much like we were talking about with WhatsApp, the feeling is if you don't get the responsibility right, if you don't get the privacy aspect right, then people will just flock to another platform that does. So it's not just doing it because it's the right reason. There's also a business reason to make sure that you get it right in the first place. So it's taken really seriously, and it's a key pillar of our sports strategy, is how we're developing the future of sport in a responsible way, whether that means anti-copyright, anti-player abuse, whether it's developing women's sport as much as men's sport as we did at YouTube, but making sure we leave sport in a better place than how we found it is something I want the team to think about.
The other part of the hardware conversation is obviously around VR, and that's been a big part of the hardware plan that Meta's been implementing for some time now. Where is that at exactly? I've heard some people that absolutely use it religiously, love the Oculus and that type of technology, and as a tool, gaming, etc. Is that still a key priority for Meta moving forward, or is these other tools, other hardware initiatives, are they more of a priority?
Certainly in my space, in the sports space, you can think about the wearables and the glasses as being a higher priority. So we'll be talking to partners a lot more about that than we have been about licensing live rights for VR, of which we've had some really good examples this year, by the way. So NBA games streamed live on VR, on Quest. The same with the Stanley Cup, the same with the Club World Cups. There's really nice experiences in there. But you're right, it's not a mass market thing, right? There's people that really, really love it. Certain demographics, and certain people really like it. Others don't use it. So I think definitely you can expect to hear more from me and my team about the wearables opportunity in the short run, more so than the VR. But it doesn't mean we're not focused on the VR. I talked about all those sub-businesses. It's still one, like Quest is still one that we're going to be supporting. But to answer your question, I think you can expect much more on the wearables front in 2026.
So with all these different tools and platforms at your disposal, and indeed at sports, in sports hands, it sounds like there's loads of ways of connecting audiences. You've kind of touched on this, but I really have to make sure we cover it, is this ability of turning audiences and the scale of what some of the best platforms can deliver, to definitive value for an industry that is more than ever being invested into by private equity with bigger commercial numbers hanging over its head that it needs to deliver, creating, I think, a real tension on where sports prioritizes its future. You mentioned Facebook. There's some revenue to be made there with growing audience, but how are you advising, telling sports, therefore, to maximize its resources, to maximize this reach and newfound scale that maybe working with Meta more closely might be giving them?
We talk about the ABC. So growing your audience, growing your business, showing your creativity. Audience, I think we've talked about and is fairly obvious, but all of those products with the billions of users can help you reach new audiences and are great for discovery of your sport. So I think that bit's super clear and the main reason people work with us. The business part, again, there is the direct revenue, but most of the reason people say they work with us is because the indirect revenue we're able to drive on. So especially on Instagram, there's a platform where users are very, very ready to take action. So if you look at sports fans, 1 in 3 of them, after seeing promotional sports content, will take a real legitimate commercial action. So they'll follow the brand that it's associated with. They'll go and buy tickets. They'll go and buy merchandise. They'll take out a subscription. And compared to my time at YouTube, they're almost 2 different parts of the funnel, I think. I think YouTube was great for brand building and reach and awareness and sort of porting TV spots onto the platform, where Meta's platforms, and obviously Instagram is the biggest one in that sense, is about the bottom half of the funnel of converting people to get them to go and do something. And so most of the joy organizations are getting from Instagram is sort of using it to grow those other business lines, the indirect revenue, if you will. And creators at large are less worried about making money from a rev share on Instagram because they know they're getting these benefits. It's also a platform that's really well made for brand deals. So this is the idea that an organization can take one of their partners or sponsors, make a short video, have a collaboration post at the top and a shop now button at the bottom, and it works really well. Or even use the creator marketplace to search which creators to partner with, select them, contract with them and work with them. So that ecosystem has been built really, really well on Instagram. So I think the grow your business bit is where I want to spend a lot of time with organizations on getting them to trust and see the value on that. And unfortunately, it's not always as neat as in the short run, there'll be this check, although we are doing that in the sponsorship space that might be interesting for certain partners, but helping them evaluate, what the value is of being on these platforms, that they all sort of feel I should be there and this is good for business, but actually measuring that is the challenge. And in some ways, that's not that different to YouTube. YouTube had the ad rev split, but it was never enough for organizations to justify being that on it. It always had to lead to something else. You had to believe that something was true to be on there. And organizations get that, but it's on us to help them a bit with that measurement piece. And the third bit, and I think this links a bit to your point about private equity, is the creativity part. So there's no other platform where you can close the loop on creativity and innovation like Meta. I think it shows your organization to be very forward thinking across any of those business lines that we talked about. And I think that's the kind of thing that in my conversations with investors, they're really looking for. So not just a property that's maximizing business in the short run, but how it's developing for the next set of fans in 10, 20 years' time. And if you look at some of the recent investments that are made, for example, from Saudi Arabia, they all kind of echo that. Properties that are building for the future, building for the next generation, that get that. And so my message would be, if you can do that, show your creativity part by working with Meta, do you help yourself put yourself in the line for investment from organizations that see you as forward thinking? I think is a good argument as well. So ABC, those are the 3 value adds that we bring to people.
A bit different to the ABCs I used to follow of sales, which is always be closing, but much better and more applicable to what we're talking about today. That makes sense. And obviously you are definitely making the message clear of sports has to be more creative in their thinking, think differently, etc. I'm trying to think of the best way to sort of wrap up this conversation. I guess where, now that you've got a bit of, clearly have a very good feel of where the focus needs to be, the education, the conversation points that need to happen. where, I guess, is your focus really going to be now? Is it going to be more education and more learning? Sorry, more learning by talking to people, or is it actually now you've got what you need to kind of just go out and educate the industry further, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's I still need to be extremely humble that I'm fairly new here and fairly new to how the industry perceives Meta. You know, you talked about that. I've got that initial sense that people say we want to hear more from you, we want to understand. But I definitely want to spend more time with the partners, listening, understanding. You know, my team have done a good job of that and they've got great insights. But me personally, listening to folks, hearing what their goals are and how we can help meet them. And last week's summit was about that as well, of having long sessions of Q&A where we could say, hey, ask us what you want, and we're keen to hear from you. So I think I wouldn't at all say that I've got everything I need. I've got a good sense, and hopefully we're starting to bring value to partners, but we crave the input from partners as well when they have ideas. I think that's something that maybe is underrated in working with Meta. The partners that are bringing along really creative ideas that say, hey, we want to do this with this product, or we've had an idea that you could be our partner as we do this, is really, really valuable. And if I had one message for the industry, it would be keep bringing those to us. It's not as simple as Meta saying, this is a property we want to work with, we'll figure it out. But we love receiving those ideas of how organizations have innovation opportunities that we might be able to match. So I think very much still in a listening phase, as well as educating the industry on what we stand for and some of the things we've talked about today.
And no doubt a lot of education of the more senior tier of the industry who maybe have just thought about Meta through the lens of just those traditional platforms we've talked about. But actually, clearly there's a lot more going on there that needs to probably a reset of thinking, a reset on their mindset about how Facebook, Instagram, Threads, WhatsApp, etc., can be an audience vehicle, but also a commercial one, even if it is through indirect means. Will definitely, I think, prick the ears up of some of the C-levels across the industry. So sounds like you've got a lot of fun conversations ahead of you, Rob, but I do really appreciate you taking the time to talk us through very informatively of where Meta sits in the industry today, all the different moving parts, and pretty impressive for someone who's only been in a few months in the role. So thank you so much for sharing and for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. Enjoy your Christmas break.
Likewise. Thanks, Rob.